The rain began before he crossed the final ridge. Not a summer drizzle, but cold, sharp droplets that slashed against the windshield as if the sea itself had reached out across the miles to greet him. The road narrowed as it curled down the hills into the edge of Elmport, and the truck's wipers thudded in time with his heart. 14 years since he had last turned down this road. 14 years since the dock lights had flickered in the distance like warning stars. Jake Miller stepped out into a different world. Elmport looked smaller. Shrunk by time, or perhaps by the storms it had survived in his absence. Storefronts once painted bright now flaked with wind-blown neglect. A rusted ice machine sat outside the shuttered bait shop. Someone had turned the old harbormaster's office into a seasonal coffee shack. The docks remained, gray and bowed under age, their warped planks curling like tired fingers toward the sea. He made his way down the pier slowly, the wooden slats creaking beneath his boots like old bones remembering his weight. A few heads turned from behind windows, eyes watching, lips not moving. No one called out. No one needed to. His name drifted on the air like ash. They remembered. At the end of the dock sat the boat. Elsa. Once the pride of the volunteer coast fleet, now a monument to failure. She lay beneath a frayed canvas tarp, her paint chipped, her rails dulled with salt corrosion. Time had not been kind. Nor had memory. But as Jake reached out and peeled back the cover, something inside him stirred, not fear, not quite guilt, but a sensation like stepping barefoot onto stones from a river you used to swim in. The cold of it hit his lungs. Elsa's name was barely legible on the stern, a faded echo of black lettering. He traced it with his calloused fingers, surprised at the tremor in his hands. The deck was littered with pine needles and sodden leaves, the helm encased in a thin film of dust. But the lines of the vessel remained the same. Beneath the years, she still held her shape. He didn't ask permission. There was no one left to ask. The harbor committee had dwindled to a clerk and a part-time maintenance worker. The only reason the patrol fleet hadn't been sold for scrap was because no one had come to buy it. Still, word spread. By midday, a small crowd had gathered along the edge of the marina, curious, uncertain. Some stood with arms crossed, faces hard with skepticism. Others simply watched with the blankness of those unsure whether they were seeing a ghost or a man. Jake moved with purpose. No speeches. No apologies. He removed the rotting lines, drained the bilge, scrubbed algae from the propeller shaft. The engine housing was stubborn but intact. Inside, the salt hadn't yet claimed the core. He climbed below deck, every hatch opened with groaning protest, each corner a memory. The wind picked up. The rain returned, harder this time. But he didn't flinch. He worked as he had always worked, silently, methodically, alone. Help arrived uninvited. A teenage boy, lean and wide-eyed, offered to carry tools. He didn't know the history, or perhaps only knew fragments, just enough to want to be near the story as it unfolded. A mechanic named Carl, barely 30, came down from the garage with spare cables and a soldering kit. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded once and got to work on the electricals. Then Anna Blake stepped onto the dock. She had her father's eyes. That was the first thing Jake noticed. Calm eyes, not angry, but deep in the way that made you careful how you spoke. She wore a navy raincoat over jeans, her hair tied back. Jake hadn't seen her since she was a child, waiting on the shore as the tide swallowed the horizon. She didn't smile. Didn't scowl. Just walked past the others and set a waterproof bag on the deck. "Medical supplies," she said quietly. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. She joined the others without ceremony, checking life jackets and packing insulated thermoses. She moved like someone who didn't need to forgive, because she understood that some grief belongs to everyone, not just the ones who stayed. The old radar array blinked awake. Lights flickered. The generator stuttered but caught. By evening, Elsa was ready. Or as ready as she would ever be. Fuel tanks were topped, provisions packed, radio tested. The skeletal crew stood soaked beneath the canopy of storm-darkened sky. Behind them, a growing crowd had gathered, silent and still. Parents held children close. Shopkeepers with shuttered windows leaned on wooden canes. Fishermen who had once shared the water with Garrett Miller now stood with hands buried deep in their pockets, watching the son attempt what the father had once done so easily. A final check. Jake stood at the helm, eyes narrowed against the rising wind. The tide had already begged *N to shift. If they waited any longer, they'd lose the last window through Wave's throat. He looked out toward the open sea, toward the line of frothing whitecaps just past the jetties. No one spoke. Then the mooring lines were released. The boat drifted backward, then caught the push of the throttle. Elsa turned, nose to the wind, and began her slow cut through the harbor. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't wave. They simply watched. As if something sacred had been awakened. Jake didn't look back. Not this time. He gripped the wheel, leaned forward, and whispered to the sea inside his memory. I'm not running anymore. No trumpet of thunder, no flash of omen. Just a thickening of the air, a hush that fell over the sea like breath held too long. The boat's bow creaked as it sliced through swelling water, the salt wind coiling through the rigging like a warning not yet shouted. Jake's hands held the wheel like a memory. Calloused palms pressed against the leather grip, fingers tightening and loosening with the rhythm of each new swell. Beside him, the boy, Lucas, watched everything without speaking. His eyes darted from the radar to the windows, then back again, learning the ocean's language in real time. Visibility dropped as they passed the outer rocks. Rain blurred the world into smears of gray. Somewhere behind them, Elmport disappeared, first its harbor lights, then its houses, then even the cliff line. Gone, swallowed by curtains of water. There were no gulls out here. No stars. Only the scream of wind and the sound of their own breath. Jake felt it return, the sensation he'd avoided for over a decade. The pull of the ocean's unpredictability. The sense that any mistake here would not be forgiven. But he didn't flinch. Not now. Not when 6 lives waited on the other side of the channel. And not when this storm had the same name as the one that had taken the men before, only this time, he was meeting it by choice. Wave's throat approached. They saw it not as a channel, but as a gate. 2 stone arms of jagged rock reached out into the sea, forming a narrowing passage between shifting tides and submerged traps. It had always been dangerous, even in calm waters. In this weather, it was suicidal. Jake didn't hesitate. He slowed the throttle, judged the spray, and tilted the boat slightly to starboard, letting the currents show themselves and how they pushed against the hull. The sea spoke in ripples, and foam caught in strange eddies, and the tilt of driftwood that spun and vanished. They entered the throat. Waves lifted and dropped the boat in hard rhythm. Each time Elsa crested, Jake adjusted the heading, 10 degrees, then 5, then nothing. The rocks loomed on both sides now, close enough that the teenager drew a sharp breath. The mechanic braced against the wall, tightening a bolt on the generator with hands slick from the rain. Anna didn't flinch. She was at the stern, adjusting the emergency flares, her face set in the same calm resolve as her father once had when hauling nets in freezing winds. She hadn't come for redemption. She'd come to help, because someone had to. One rogue wave slammed into the port side with the force of a truck. The boat listed, groaned, and righted again. Jake gritted his teeth. The old muscles remembered. He didn't fight the wave, he let it pass under them, timing the engine's correction with its retreat. And then they were through. Wave's throat fell behind them, replaced by deeper, darker water. Thorn Point came into view, barely a smear of land against the charcoal sky. The beacon light that once sat atop the point was out. But Jake had memorized this coastline as a boy. He knew the angle of every inlet, the way the island's trees bent in the wind, how the waves curved when they touched the southern shoals. The radio crackled, then nothing. Too far out for clean signals. They would have to navigate without updates. When they reached the island, the scene was desperate. 6 fishermen huddled beneath a broken shelter made from canvas and netting. Their boat, half submerged, was clearly unsalvageable. One man limped forward, waving his arms. Another sat motionless, wrapped in a thermal blanket, eyes wide and unfocused. Hypothermia. Maybe worse. Jake pulled Elsa alongside the shattered dock, shouted instructions the wind immediately swallowed, and began the loading process. It wasn't graceful. Every movement had to be timed between swells. The mechanic hauled gear. Lucas helped fasten safety lines. Anna administered water and emergency heat packs from the med kit. One man collapsed the moment he stepped aboard. The rain became needles. The wind roared. Then came the call no sailor ever wants to hear. The main routes blocked. Carl shouted, pointing toward the east. Debris and downed trees, no way we're getting through. Jake turned toward the harbor's return path and saw the truth. The sea had risen too fast. Piers submerged. Logs and broken pier segments smashed together like battering rams. The way back was gone. He stood in the wheelhouse, breathing hard, the radio dead. In that moment, the past knocked loudest. Not again. Not again. But his eyes darted toward the northern cliffs. Old maps. Forgotten channels. Back when Elmport had been a coal trade town, they'd carved alternate routes, canals now overgrown and disused. Ones his father once traced with a pencil when teaching navigation. They weren't on the modern charts. But Jake remembered. He turned the wheel. Hard. The crew didn't question. They followed as the boat angled away from the known. Into darkness. Into passages unlit by lighthouse or satellite. The sea rose behind them like judgment. But Elsa didn't falter. She was home again. The cliffs loomed like forgotten monuments, their jagged edges shrouded in mist and history. Jake guided Elsa toward a gap so narrow it felt more like a wound in the coastline than a passage. Centuries ago, ships had hauled coal through these cuts in the rock, back when Elmport had mattered to the world beyond its shores. But those days were long gone, the canals abandoned, overrun by weeds, and lost to maps that favored safer, newer routes. Jake hadn't seen these waters since boyhood. He remembered following his father on fishing runs that skirted the edge of these cliffs, listening to old tales about bootleggers, smugglers, and storms that swallowed ships whole. Nobody used the inner passages anymore. Most didn't even believe they were navigable. But Jake remembered them, not just in theory, but in the muscle memory of someone who had once seen the way the sea carved paths where men thought none existed. The boat creaked as it entered the hidden channel. The cliffs closed in. The air felt colder. Still, Jake pressed on, his fingers tightening on the throttle as the engine labored through the narrow cut. The hull scraped against submerged roots and half-sunken logs. Moss-covered stone walls flanked them on either side, weeping with runoff and stained by time. Branches reached low over the water like skeletal arms. Lucas, standing on deck, ducked instinctively as one scraped along the roof of the wheelhouse. "Are we even on water anymore?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was lost in the wind and the steady churn of the engine. Anna moved through the cabin, checking on the rescued men. One of them had stopped shivering, which wasn't a good sign. She wrapped him tighter in the emergency blankets, placed her hand near his cheek, and cursed under her breath at how cold his skin had become. Carl passed her a small camping stove from the supply box, already lit and warming a pot of broth. Every little detail mattered now: warmth, calories, hope. Jake kept one eye on the path ahead, the other on the barometer. The storm wasn't done. It was shifting inland, chasing them through the backcountry. Above the cliffs, trees bent sideways in the wind, dropping limbs and debris into the channel. Twice they had to stop, once to push aside a fallen branch using a pole from the rescue kit, and once to reverse slowly around a collapsed footbridge that had sunk into the water like a dying animal. The tension on board grew with each mile. The canal narrowed again, curling through overgrown marshland where cattails and reeds whispered rumors of abandonment. Somewhere nearby, a heron took flight, startled by the unfamiliar sound of a boat in waters long silent. Mist clung to the trees and low sheets, muffling every sound except the slow churn of Elsa's engine and the occasional clatter of gear shifting below deck. It was Lucas who spotted the stone markers. Faint and moss-covered, but real. One on each bank, old mooring stones from a bygone era. "This is it," Jake muttered under his breath. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift for a moment. The current was weak here, almost still. The cliffs had given way to lowland. Beyond the trees, the land began to slope downward. If the route was correct, it would curve past an abandoned drydock, then empty into a basin on the northern edge of Elmport, hidden from the main harbor by a crescent of high ground. Jake reignited the motor and pushed forward. The final stretch was the most brutal. Branches clawed at the sides. One of the propellers struck a submerged stone and groaned, sending vibrations through the hull. For a terrifying minute, they drifted while Carl clambered below to inspect the damage. But the engine held. The prop shaft hadn't snapped. Luck, or maybe grace. Either way, they pressed on. Then it appeared, sudden and silent. The basin. A wide, circular inlet tucked between cliff walls, sheltered from the wind by its shape and elevation. The storm still howled overhead, but within this ancient harbor, the water lay calm. No current. No debris. Just open space, ringed by decaying docks and iron ladders rusted into place. They had made it through. Jake eased the throttle back and let Elsa glide gently into the basin. The others stood quietly, each one realizing the weight of what had just happened. Not just survival, but navigation through something almost mythical. A path no one believed in, except a man haunted by his past. From here, the final stretch to Elmport was clear. A narrow estuary branched off the basin, leading directly toward the town's old supply pier. It was still high enough above the floodwaters to allow docking, still connected by gravel path to the village center. And for the first time since the storm began, Jake allowed himself to breathe. He stepped out onto the deck, the rain easing into a steady drizzle. Anna joined him, her jacket soaked, her face streaked with dirt and salt. She said nothing, only looked out toward the estuary, then back at the 6 lives they had pulled from the brink. Lucas slumped against a railing, exhausted but alert, a look of hard-earned awe etched on his face. And Carl, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag, offered Jake the barest nod of approval, one sailor to another. No celebration. No applause. Only the quiet reverence of those who had seen what shouldn't have been possible, and had passed through it. Jake looked out toward the faint glow of Elmport in the distance. Home waited. The sea had tried again. But this time, it had not won. The first light of dawn broke not with fanfare, but with the slow dissolving of shadows. Mist curled over the basin like a soft veil. Beyond the estuary, Elmport's coastline shimmered under a thin coat of rainwater and debris. Trees leaned askew. Docks sagged. Roofs had lost shingles, and windows reflected the weary relief of survival. But the village was still there, bruised, battered, but standing. Jake guided Elsa through the narrow estuary, her battered hull gliding over water as smooth as glass. Every creak of the old vessel seemed to echo across the silence. The town's few working radios had spread word during the night, a boat was coming. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was a ghost. People gathered along the high pier. Old fishermen wrapped in blankets. Mothers clutching children close to their sides. Teenagers rubbing sleep from their eyes. Shopkeepers in mud-streaked aprons. All stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned toward the water as if drawn by some invisible thread. And there, cutting through the pale mist like a memory resurrected, came Elsa. The boat that had once left them broken now returned full, bearing every life it had been sent to save. Jake throttled down and coasted into the dock. A final shudder passed through the hull as the vessel bumped gently against the worn pilings. Anna was the first to move, securing lines with practiced speed. Lucas scrambled to the side, helping Carl lower the gangplank. Together, they moved the fishermen ashore, some limping, others needing 2 sets of arms to steady them. The villagers made no sound. Only the cry of gulls overhead marked the passing of time. Jake remained at the helm for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel. He had stood here before, years ago, at the end of a voyage that had brought only loss. He had walked ashore then with nothing left but regret. Now, there was something different in the air. He stepped off the boat. No applause met him. No cheers. Just silence, thick and waiting. He crossed the dock slowly, his boots heavy with exhaustion and rainwater, and came to a halt before the crowd. Among them stood the mayor, an older man now, wearing an orange slicker and a weathered face. He held something wrapped carefully in cloth. At his side, 2 town council members, soaked to the bone but standing straight. Behind them, more faces, familiar and unfamiliar, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid over 14 years. The mayor stepped forward. In his hands, he unwrapped a plaque, simple, hand-carved, the wood darkened from being saved for a ceremony that had never come. Across the surface were words Jake hadn't expected to ever see. In gratitude to those who brave the waters when others cannot. The mayor cleared his throat. No speeches, he said gruffly, the words almost lost in the breeze. Just thanks. He offered Jake the plaque. Jake didn't move for a moment. The wind stirred the edges of his jacket, lifting the heavy scent of salt and diesel. Around him, the faces of those who had once turned away now looked back without anger, without blame. Only with the quiet acknowledgement of a debt repaid in full measure. He reached out and took the plaque. Not as a prize. Not as absolution. But as a marker of something harder and more real, a life rebuilt, a trust regained. Behind him, Anna stood quietly, arms crossed. Carl leaned on the railing, his well-streaked rag forgotten. Lucas shifted his weight, clutching a worn piece of rope between nervous hands, trying not to grin. The sun rose higher, throwing pale gold across the battered village. In its light, the scars of the night were clear, fallen trees, shattered windows, overturned market stalls. But the people were alive. The town was whole. For the first time in 14 years, Jake smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't triumphant. It was the smile of a man who knew that redemption didn't come in grand gestures or loud announcements. It came in quiet mornings, and battered boats returning home, and lives saved when it mattered most. The villagers began to disperse slowly, moving back toward their homes and the work ahead. No one rushed. No one needed to. They left behind a space where something unseen had been mended. Jake turned back toward Elsa. There would be repairs to make. A new safety unit to form. Young captains to train who had never learned to fear the sea but respected it all the same. He would stay. Not because he was owed anything, but because the ocean hadn't called him back to punish him. It had called him back to remind him who he had always been. At the stern of Elsa, an old compass swung gently on its rusted chain, pointing not north, but home. Kindness without question is enough.